Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Creating and Maintaining Intimacy in a Long-Term Romantic Relationship, with our presenter, Dr. Alexandra Solomon. My name is Cassie Petoskey, and I'm the Assistant Director of Career Advancement for your Northwestern Alumni Association. The NAA is delighted to collaborate on this webinar with the Family Institute at Northwestern University. The Family Institute is a behavioral health group practice committed to whole health for individuals, families, and couples. Located in Chicago, Evanston, Northbrook, and Westchester, the Family Institute is an organization of educators, researchers, and therapists partnering with their clients to see change. We'll begin shortly, and we're so excited that Dr. Solomon could join us for this great topic. But first, there's just a few housekeeping items I'd like to share with you. If you haven't used this Big Marker platform just yet, you'll notice on the right-hand side of your screen that there are a few different tabs there. Please feel free to send in any questions that you have for Dr. Solomon now, as well as throughout the presentation through the Q&A tab. I'll be keeping an eye on that, and we'll save plenty of time at the end to take those questions. And should you experience any technical issues during the webinar, you can email the Big Marker team for further assistance at support@bigmarker.com. I'll send that email address out in the chat box so that you have it, but also just keep in mind to make sure that you have a really good internet connection, as well as try not to have any other tabs open on your screen while you're attending the presentation. And lastly, a link to access the recording of the webinar will be sent to all registrants later today. Now let's move on to why we're all here. Dr. Solomon is an international speaker and consultant. She's a writer for Psychology Today and the professor for the course Building Love and Lasting Relationships, Marriage 101. Dr. Solomon is the author of the best-selling book, Loving Bravely, 20 Lessons of Self-Discovery to Help You Get the Love You Want. She is also a faculty member at the Family Institute, and we're so glad to have her here with us today. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Solomon.
Thank you for having me. This is fun. I'm glad to be here.
Great. Well, I will let you take it from here, and I'll take my camera down so you can do your presentation.
Okay, sounds great. Hi, everybody. It's such a lovely way to be able to connect in terms of being able to have the kind of global reach that the university is able to have. I must say that it would be a little bit more fun to be all in the same place, that I could see you and hear you and connect with you that way. But there are pros and cons to all paths, right? So we've got some time together to talk about what intimacy looks like in our long-term relationships. And it's one of my favorite topics, something I talk about and think about and work on quite a bit in a variety of formats. And I'm happy to be here with you guys, and to whenever something happens, whenever the university calls, I show up. It's been my home away from home for the last, I don't know, close to 20 years. And springtime in Evanston is the best. We just started teaching the 18th time through the Marriage 101 course. So we've got 80 bright and eager young undergraduate students, and then we get to spend 10 weeks together talking all about love and sex and partnership, and they leave wiser and more resilient, and it's a really special part of the work that I do. So, okay, we are going to just dive right in. I'm going to give you a little bit of sort of like locate us contextually in terms of who are we in terms of what are we wanting and expecting in our intimate relationships today. We're going to do sort of a 10,000-foot view. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the paradigm that I use in my clinical work and my teaching and my writing and speaking, about sort of the heart or the essence of intimate relationships and what we need to bring to the table in order to create not just healthy and happy relationships, but successful, thriving, resilient, adaptive, intimate relationships. And then we're going to get into the nuts and bolts. We'll talk about sort of the components or elements of sexual intimacy and the components and elements of emotional intimacy, and how the ebb and flow works between those kind of two formats of intimacy. So here's where we start. Let's see. There we go. Okay. The first thing is that love is alive and dynamic. It is organic, it's fluid, it grows and changes throughout our lifetime. So when I'm sitting with a couple in therapy in year, let's say 15 of their relationship, And one of the judgments they're making about their romantic relationship is it doesn't feel the way that it used to. You aren't the way you used to be, and we aren't the way that we used to be. I smile and I nod and I say, of course you aren't. But one of the things that gets us into trouble is that we have an idea in our head that that love ought to be steady. And it's not. It grows and changes as we change, as the context of our lives change. And we get ourselves into trouble when we hold on to old models and old paradigms. So the couples who are able to navigate the trickiness of change are the couples who can adapt and sort of reimagine who they are individually and collectively, so that the love relationship becomes a co-creative, imaginative process where there's a shedding of the old ways and a creation of the new ways. It's sort of this like a death rebirth cycle that happens again and again throughout a relationship. So we can grieve the loss of who we used to be and create again who we are now. And the grieving and letting go doesn't necessarily need to be a sad process, but it's a process of sort of accepting and oftentimes a reminiscing. One of the things that's really lovely about being in a longer term relationship is when you can sort of look back and reminisce about the old days, not with sadness, but with nostalgia. And that's a difficult place to find, that sort of more complicated place of accepting change and moving through. One of my supervisors said to me very early in my training of being a couples therapist, she said, the marriage that you need when you're 30 is not the marriage you need when you're 50, and it's not the marriage that you need when you're 70. And if you're very lucky, and I would add very skilled, those three marriages are all with the same person. That kind of brings home that point. Okay. One of my dear colleagues at Northwestern, Eli Finkel, kind of captured what a number of people have been talking about and thinking about for years, which is the changing face of intimate relationships, and put together, sort of mapped the history of marriage onto this diagram that some of you may recognize from Psychology 101. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So way back in the day, 1943. Maslow mapped out this idea that we human beings have a hierarchy of psychological needs, and we can't meet higher level needs until and unless we're able to meet lower level needs. And so he sort of mapped it out this way, Maslow did. The need for sort of physiological needs, food, water, and shelter, take precedence over are sort of the base of the triangle, and building up to psychological needs. I can see that my camera is frozen, but I'm thinking my microphone is okay. I'm going to just keep on going. Whoops.
Yeah, you're good. We can still hear you, Dr. Solomon. Sorry about the camera. Hopefully it'll fix itself.
Yeah, I'm frozen in an awkward there. Well, I'm going to keep going. Basic needs, psychological needs, the need for closeness and friendship and belonging, and then those highest level needs, which he called the self-actualization needs, the need to sort of realize your potential and sort of be spiritually aware. So those were sort of the highest level needs in Maslow's mind. And interestingly, when we look at the big picture, the historical context of intimate partnership, historically, we're going to call it pre-1865, what we expected in our marriages would be that our marriages would meet those basic needs for safety, food, water, and shelter. So she needed him to guard the cave, and he needed her to care for the baby. So it was and I'm doing that in a really stereotypic gendered kind of a way. But those sort of basic needs for the marriage was expected to kind of keep us both alive. 1865 to 1965, there was a shift towards, this whole thing goes better if we also like each other and we're fond of each other. And so people started to expect also of their relationships, keep me safe, let's raise a family together, work together to put shelter over our heads and food on the table. But also, I want to belong. I want to be part of a family. I want that sort of sense of warmth between us. And then post 1965, for a number of reasons that have to do, the number of things, civil rights movement, gender movement, changing roles of men and women, economic changes, we have begun to expect of our intimate partnerships that they will meet these highest level needs, that our intimate partnerships will have as their foundation intimacy, which it would be defined in this paradigm as sort of the idea of into me, see. I want you to see my innermost self. I want to be able to bring my innermost self. It ties to sort of the evolution of the field of psychology, the field of therapy, the field of self-help, the idea that the self in modernity takes on a different meaning. Myself is sort of an ongoing art project of figuring out who I am, where I came from, what I want, what I value. This is not historically how human beings have kind of conceived of self as a project, an evolving project. And we also take that same desire into our romantic relationships now, where we expect a kind of intimate partnership that is historically unprecedented and frankly is still not globally the norm. So if you look at all of the marriages that happen around the world, over half of them are arranged marriages. So it is still not the norm. It is still not normal to put at the heart of a romantic relationship the idea of love, of soulmate, of best friend, of intimate partner, in the way that Westerners do and have done now for some time. So the point being here that we are expecting, what we're expecting from our intimate relationships is high level, and it's unprecedented, and it requires a different kind of skill set. So I am all for placing the bar high, wanting to be fully seen, authentically known, cared for, nurtured. I'm all for couples demanding and cultivating sexual intimacy over time. I think those expectations are wonderful. But I want to just make the point here on this slide that it's a high level expectation, and it's not something that we can look up our lineage for. What our grandparents, I mean, it doesn't matter who's on this call in terms of, I know there's probably an age range on this call, but in terms of looking at our grandparents' marriages and even our parents' marriages, they may not be the template for what we want in our marriages, for what modern marriages by and large are expecting. Okay, so fine, put the expectations high, but then bring with it the kind of accountability and skill set that one needs to create these kinds of marriages. And so let's talk about what that looks like. In the book Loving Bravely, I call this relational self-awareness. It is the heart of the Marriage 101 course that I teach. It's really the heart of all of the work that I do, which is the idea that the centerpiece of a romantic relationship needs to be relational self-awareness if we're going to ask of that relationship that it be a place for spiritual growth, in emotional intimacy, sexual intimacy, that in order for it to be able to handle the kinds of demands that modernity puts on our relationships. Relational self-awareness is defined as an ongoing commitment to taking a curious and compassionate stance vis-a-vis oneself in love. So through this lens, in order to create a healthy, happy romantic relationship, I have to be willing to ask what I call the $1 million question in love, which is this question. What's it like to be with me right now? It's a question that I ask myself. We ask ourselves the question, what's it like to be with me right now in this relationship? In other words, how am I coming across to my partner? How am I showing up right now in my relationship? It's very easy, for all kinds of reasons, to get into this kind of finger-pointing stance. My husband and I are entering our 20th year. We'll celebrate our 20-year anniversary this August of our marriage. We're raising 2 kids, 2 teenagers. It's very easy. I mean, I could, and I do, sometimes find myself thinking in my head about all the ways that my husband frustrates me. And I could give you a list of all the ways that he is just a thorn in my side sometimes. And he's a little too this, and he's not quite enough this, and da 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 da. That is, that's the stance of a lack of self-awareness. A far more courageous stance is to ask questions like, how am I coming across? What am I bringing out? What am I putting into the space? Or if I'm experiencing him as too much this, why is that? What's going on inside of me right now? I want to just point out the image on this slide is called kintsugi. It's a Japanese ceramics technique. One of my graduate students wrote a paper years ago for me, and she used this image to kind of capture how she experiences herself, and it's really stuck with me. So kintsugi is this idea, Japanese ceramics technique, as I said, that when a piece of pottery falls on the floor and breaks, rather than either throwing it away or putting it back together in a way where you can't even see that it broke, you take molten precious metal and put it back together in that way, so that you really are bringing the eye to the cracks, to the broken places. And that's what so that image really captures for me the heart of relational self-awareness, this idea of I'm willing to look at places where I may be falling short, where I may be getting triggered by my own stuff. And that kind of willingness that I don't have to be perfect, and I don't have to expect you to be perfect. And our relationship becomes this crucible of growth for both of us, where we become each other's teachers. I often say that love is a classroom. So love is a classroom that grows us and evolves us like few other things in our lives can. Okay, so I will loop back to that theme, I'm sure, but I'm going to move on to okay. Another way of breaking this out, the idea of relational self-awareness, is I call this the golden equation of love. Every moment of frustration, of misunderstanding, of disappointment, of tension, of friction in our romantic relationships, in every one of those moments, we can map it out in this way. There's always a my stuff plus your stuff equals our stuff, meaning that we bring into our relationships our entire histories. And a lot of my work is understanding the impact of our early experiences. I'm a family therapist, so I look always at family dynamics and family patterns. And we always bring into our romantic relationships stories, patterns, paradigms, and belief systems from the families we grew up in. We are, as children, little social scientists, and we absorb from our households growing up all kinds of messages that have to do with emotion, how difference gets handled, how much how apology works. Do we apologize to each other, or do we sweep it under the rug? How forgiveness works. Do we let go, or do we hold grudges? How misunderstandings get repaired, how gender gets navigated, how power gets wielded, how what vulnerability is met with. So as little people, we absorb. Little people don't really have a psychological or emotional boundary. They just take in what's around them and bring that into adulthood. And so bring those patterns into adulthood. So I bring my patterns in, and my partner brings their patterns in, and they commingle, along with personality traits and temperaments. Personality traits and temperaments and culture. So when two people come together, it really is two entire cultures that come together, not just family cultures, but also racial, ethnic, geographic, religious cultures coming together. And so in that relationally self-aware stance, in a moment of friction, we get curious rather than pointing fingers and blaming. To what degree can we get curious and say, help me understand how you're experiencing this moment right now? Knowing that it's always about something that has to do with me and something that has to do with you, kind of commingling to create this dance or this pattern. So when I begin with a couple on day one, very often the expectation, it's not said out loud usually. Sometimes it's said out loud, but it's always there. It tends to be there in the room with us. This idea, oh, audio is spotty. Um, this idea that in the therapy is going to be about, so partner A feels like therapy, couples therapy is going to be partner A and I, couples therapist, working together to fix partner B. And partner B is pretty darn sure that this couples therapy is going to be about partner B and I fixing partner A. So that is just kind of our knee-jerk default stance. It's much easier to see what the other guy is doing to drive us crazy versus seeing how it's a little bit of me and a little bit of you, and we're getting stuck in this dance. So the language that I very often use goes like this. The more I do X, the more you do Y. The more you do Y, the more I do X. And round we go. That's a framework from one of my a leader in our field, Dr. Sue Johnson, who created emotion-focused therapy. Really has been such a helpful leader in terms of helping us think about how the psychology of each individual commingles to create the psychology of the couple. And that's always how it is. It's always my stuff plus your stuff equals our stuff. We know that we've lost that relationally self-aware stance when either blame or shame is ruling the day. So if I'm stuck in a finger-pointing, blaming stance, I've slipped out of intimacy. I've slipped out of self-awareness. Or conversely, if I'm lost in shame, this idea that I'm ruining what would be otherwise a fine relationship with my stuff, that's also another way of slipping out of that relationally self-aware stance, right? There's a lot in a place of shame, there isn't intimacy. Intimacy requires two people showing up and making something together. So we lose intimacy when we slip into blame. We lose intimacy when we get lost in shame. Shame is that sense that I'm ruining this for us. My stuff is too big. I'm too broken. I'm too damaged. So when shame is ruling the day, intimacy gets lost. So those are two patterns that I'm always looking for. Those are really essential pieces of couples therapy and of all the work that I do. Okay, so said another way, relational self-awareness, a commitment. So relational self-awareness is not a one and done kind of a thing. It's not like, I read one book and I got myself figured out, or I take one class and I've got myself figured out. It is an ongoing life journey, because whatever we have figured out, at age whatever, then we have a kid and it's all up for grabs again. And then we hit midlife and it's all up for grabs again. And then we, launch babies from the nest and it's all up for grabs again. So this stance, this relationally self-aware stance, is an ongoing commitment to just being open and curious and compassionate with everything that life stirs in me. And the degree to which I can do that for myself is the degree to which I can do that for my partner. I can be no more compassionate with my partner than I'm able to be with myself. So that, and the more we can be relational self-awareness improves our romantic relationships, and our romantic relationships push and evolve us in that relationally self-aware kind of a way. Okay, so why does all of this matter? The research is clear that the research is clear that the quality of our lives is by and large determined by the quality of our relationships. There's really no way of getting around that. One of the most powerful pieces of data around for this is the Harvard study by George Valiant, who studied 268 men for 75 years. The study continues now with women as well. And the bottom line of the study, he looked at all kinds of variables about career and money and physical health. The bottom line is happiness is only the cart, love is the horse. He says there are two pillars of happiness. One is love, and the other is finding a way of coping with life that does not push love away. So that really is the bottom line here, that this matters. Nurturing quality relationships in our lives matters. Another way of saying it is to take a look at the numbers on your screen. The correlations. So this is a meta-analytic review. So a team of researchers came through and looked at data from a number of studies and pulled together this bottom line notion that if you look at a composite measure of happiness and well-being and other things, I'm seeing that there's no audio, so I'm gonna keep talking, Cassie, and
Yeah. I think for people who are on that are potentially having audio issues, try refreshing your browser. I will send that through the chat so everybody knows that. But Dr. Solomon, why don't we just have you take your camera down since it has stayed frozen, and we'll just have you go audio only, and maybe that'll clear some of this up for some of these folks. Hi, everyone. Dr. Solomon will be right back. I think she's getting, she's just turning her microphone back on.
Okay. Can you hear me back? Can you hear me now? Am I good?
Yes. Perfect. Thanks.
Okay. Oh, the joys of technology. See, if we were all in a big old room, we could just keep on plowing. Okay. So, so I was saying that when researchers have looked at a composite measure of happiness and well-being, and compared it against other variables, here's what they came up with. There is a decent positive correlation between overall happiness and income, which makes sense, right? It's easier to say that we're happy and content in our lives when we're able to put roofs over our heads and food on the table. So that's not a surprise. And then a stronger positive correlation between social support and happiness. We have a strong, deep-seated need to belong, to feel like we have people to turn to bring us chicken soup when we're sick and celebrate our happy moments with us. So there's no surprise there that there's a nice, solid, positive correlation there between happiness and social support. It's why the field of loneliness research is really strong and important right now, is that we don't, as a species, do well with loneliness. But then take a look there. Positivity in an intimate relationship has by far the strongest correlation to overall happiness, which does not mean that single people cannot be happy. It does mean that the quality of your intimate relationship matters tremendously in terms of your overall health. It's pretty difficult to say that you are, the sun is shining, the birds are singing, you're happy as a clam, and there's tremendous trouble at home, either toxic communication patterns or neglect or abuse or disconnection. It counts. It casts, the quality of our intimate relationships casts a big shadow over everything else. So that's why it matters, and that's why, that's why I'm so passionate about offering all young people high quality relationship education, so they can set healthy patterns down from the beginning, and also offering this material to people at every stage of the game, because we just don't do it. We'll talk in a minute about the fact that we don't offer a lot of relationship education, and the field of relationship science is so strong now. We know so much about the kinds of skills and paradigms and practices that people really need in order to nurture love. And it matters. And the converse, the data that shows the converse is as strong. So the converse would be the toll that unhealthy romantic relationships take on our health. Marital conflict is associated with all kinds of problematic things, like increased risk of cancer, cardiac disease, chronic pain, because we know that conflict really, really profoundly affects our physiology. It's called DPA, diffuse physiological arousal. That kind of chronic fight-flight sense of having your guard up, waiting for the shoe to drop, feeling tense. That state of being takes a toll on our bodies, our immune systems, our endocrine systems, and our cardiovascular systems. So this is why couples who are struggling with conflict or disconnection, it's why couples therapy is so vitally important. And it works. The research to support the efficacy of couples therapy is very strong. One study I just read recently that kind of brings this whole point home is about couples brought into a lab, and they were given little blisters on their arms, and then the research team tracked wound healing, and they found that couples where there was unremitting conflict, the wound healed more slowly. The reason being that healthy communication is tied to higher vasopressin and oxytocin, and those things help with wound healing, basically. So our immune systems are compromised by chronic, unremitting conflict. And couples therapy is the treatment for that problem. Okay. There is no graceful segue from that into talking about sex, so we're just gonna go right into it. The million-dollar question really is, does emotional intimacy open the door to sexual intimacy, or does sexual intimacy open the door to emotional intimacy? Those are two sort of channels, right? If we think of the overall idea of supporting intimacy in a long-term relationship, intimacy comes in many forms, and the two we're going to focus on for the rest of the webinar are emotional intimacy and sexual intimacy. And I have sat with a number of couples where one partner says, I need to feel like you've got my back. I need to feel partnered with you in order to enter that sexual space with you. And the other partner says, being sexual with you helps me create that sense of partnership, of intimacy, of closeness with you. And it ends up feeling in that moment, at least, like somewhat of a standoff, right? How do we navigate these sort of different pathways to intimacy? And that answer is complicated and couple specific. But both, the answer really is yes. Both things are true. There's a flow between emotional closeness and sexual closeness, and the arrow goes in both directions. As one of my a friend of mine and a mentor of mine, Esther Perel, says, we think that we don't touch because we're angry, but we're also angry because we haven't touched. So that arrow goes back and forth. And I think historically, couples therapists certainly have thought that if you improve a couple's relationship, the sex will follow. And there's more attention now to finding ways to make that arrow go back and forth. The more we can help couples touch and engage and feel close to each other, the more they also create that cushion that helps them just navigate the rough moments together. One thing I didn't say about conflict before is there's no such thing as a long-term relationship without conflict. That just doesn't happen. So the question isn't whether or not there's going to be conflict. The question is, what's the degree to which a couple can navigate conflict? And ultimately, keep in mind the idea that conflict can be a vehicle for greater closeness, a vehicle for greater understanding. It's in those moments of friction and tension that we have the opportunity to learn something new about ourselves and our partners. And that is not something that people who are conflict avoidant like to hear. But when conflict is done well, when those moments of misunderstanding are done well, they can open something closer for a couple. It's called a tear and repair process, we call it. There's something about the kind of losing and finding process that can be strengthening. So when researchers have looked at how important, sort of asked this question of how important is sex in a long-term relationship, what they found is that being satisfied with your sexual relationship gives you about a 10 to 15% bump in relationship satisfaction. But being disappointed in the quality of your sexual relationship compromises relationship quality by about 50 to 70%. So you can't sort of buy your way into a healthy relationship by just being incredibly sexually compatible, but it's also really hard to say that you're happy overall if there's distress and distance about sex. And I'm not saying that you have to be sexually active. There are couples who have really rich romantic relationships and have taken sex off the table because for both partners, it's not a value, and they have ways of being physically close and connected and emotionally close and connected that don't rely on anything specifically sexual. But if it's a problem for one or an issue of tension and misunderstanding, it tends to take quite a toll on a relationship. I'm going to skip. I'm going to come back to these two slides and start with us here. And the way I'm going to start this is by saying that given that information, that how a couple connects sexually dictates quite a bit about how they feel about the quality of their relationship, it is problematic then that we spend so little time educating people about sex and about what sexual health looks like, what healthy and happy sexual expression looks like. So the CDC has outlined 16 topics that kids ought to have in sex education. So the CDC has done this. They said these are the 16 topics that really need to get covered to offer kids kind of like the foundation they need for understanding sex and what they need to kind of get launched into adolescence and young adulthood. Okay. And they found that 1/2 of high schools in this country are covering those 16 topics. 1/2. Coin toss, whether or not any given kid in a high school has gotten the information that they need to make sexually healthy decisions for themselves. 20% of middle schools are covering those 16 topics. So then we grow up and enter these sexual relationships and somehow are expected to be able to handle ourselves well when we haven't had great conversations. Add to that now that we live in an era of high stream, free, accessible 24/7 internet pornography, and we've got a real problem on our hands. Something that I think that we all ought to be thinking about and educating ourselves on, and for those of us who are parents, thinking about it in terms of what our kids really need from us, which is conversation about sex in a relationship, about how do you come to know who you are sexually. And I know that after the webinar, you're going to get some resources, and in those resources are some books and websites and access to a link to the blog on my website. And I recently I've been doing some speaking engagements about supporting parents talking to their kids and their teens and their young adults, not just about sex, but about sex and sex within a conversation, a larger conversation about relationship, about dating, about pornography, about intimacy. I think all those conversations need to be had together. We sort of think of sex as the talk and sort of like separate from everything else. What would happen for our kids and frankly for ourselves if conversations about sex were part of larger conversations about self, about relationship, about connection, about expression, about gender, about culture? So I recently wrote a blog about that, which has some additional resources. So I direct you to all of that. But here's one piece that I think is really important that we are not talking nearly enough about, which is this. This is historically what researchers would teach and promote as the human sexual response cycle. This is Masters and Johnson, and then Kaplan. And this was the definition of sort of how humans do sex. There is desire. That's the idea. First step is desire, that sort of feeling of, I would like to have sex. Next is arousal, plateau, orgasm, for those who are very lucky, more orgasm, and resolution. That's been thought of as the human sexual response cycle. Okay, so then by default then, dysfunction, pathology, was defined and operationalized as those who didn't meet this diagram: desire, arousal, resolution. And what happened was, the more they went along, there were a lot of a certain kind of people who were being diagnosed with arousal disorder, desire disorder. And those kind of people were women people, women, people who lived in female bodies, were sort of being diagnosed as having this problem because they would report either that they didn't have desire, or arousal came first and then desire. And so for a long time, there was sort of this pathologizing stance, until some brave researchers decided to start thinking about it differently. Half the population is struggling. Maybe we need to rethink this. And here's where they went next. They started to think about this nonlinear model of the female sexual response. Oftentimes, when I put this slide up, men who love women can kind of have like a, oh, really? Like, it looks real complicated kind of a response to this. And it's not that complicated. And it actually doesn't fall. It's not as if, I'm saying it too simply. It's not as if this is men and this is women. It's that there are two kinds of desire. There is spontaneous desire, where the first step of a sexual encounter is this idea of like, I would like to have sex. And there is responsive desire, which is, I wasn't thinking about sex. That's not my first cue for sex wasn't that I felt a tingling in my loins, if you will. It was that I feel emotionally close to you. It was that we watched something together that was a little sexy. It was that I'm feeling really relaxed and at ease right now. And that becomes the first step. Or I can tell that you want to, and I'm willing. And I know that in our relationship, once we get started, my body responds. And I trust you, and I know you, and I know that if my body doesn't respond, I'm going to say stop, and you will. And so let's get started. That's responsive desire. The queen of this, sort of spreading the word on this really, really important distinction between spontaneous and responsive desire, the queen of that world is Emily Nagoski. She's written a really wonderful book called Come As You Are, which definitely is about women, and definitely makes a pretty strong case for the fact that if we had to draw a line in the sand, we would put those who live in male bodies a little bit more on the side of spontaneous desire, and we would put those who live in female bodies a little bit more in the responsive desire camp. But there are lots of us who live beyond the binary, who are transgender, who are genderqueer, and whose expression may take different forms. There are times that women have spontaneous desire, their male partners have responsive desire. So take this as a framework, but don't get wedded to the idea of this sort of like an either or. But what tends to happen is opening up this idea that there are multiple pathways into a sexual space ends up feeling for people like a big collective exhale, like, oh my gosh. Because what happens is those who have responsive desire are at tremendous risk of feeling shame. I'm doing it wrong. The fact that I don't want to jump your bones all the time must mean that we're doomed. The fact that it's hard for me if I'm stressed out to shift into that sexual space means that I'm damaged and broken. And add to that, if somebody with responsive desire is partnered with somebody who has spontaneous desire, it's very easy then for the spontaneous desire partner to feel like, you don't love me, you're not drawn to me, I must not be attractive to you. So what freedom opens up then when we start to say, you know what, there are different pathways in. And what you as a couple are tasked to do is have some conversations and figure this out together. And so the best scenario is that this is exciting. This is about possibility. This is about creation. This is about imagination. This is about talking about things that have needed to be talked about for years. And it can begin with, so there's this like sort of self-exploration and relational conversation. So these are some questions that I really like people to sit with. What were the early messages that you were given about sex, and to what degree do they serve or hinder you today? If you were taught that good girls don't, and now you're in a marriage, what do you do with that message? What for you are the ingredients of a good and fulfilling sexual experience with another person? What for you? Not what did you see in porn, not what were you told, not what did other people say. From the inside out, what for you creates a great experience? What do you believe is the role of sex in an intimate relationship? What's your relationship like with physical touch? How does your relationship with your body affect how you feel sexually? For many, many people, sexual pleasure and sexual ease are compromised by shame-loaded messages that have to do with body image for very good reason, right? We are loaded up with a lot of images of that we need to be perfect in order to be sexy. And so there's a kind of freedom that comes from accepting our bodies and loving our bodies and being gentle with our bodies, and reclaiming this idea that we are entitled to pleasure and play, which is the last question. What's your relationship with pleasure? Sex sometimes is purposeful when people are, you know, um, creating life. That is certainly creating a baby. That is certainly sort of like a means to an end. Sex is a means to an end, a biological means to an end. But for many of us, a lot of the time, entering a sexual space with another person is a space of play. It's a space of being. It's a space of escape, of connection. And so if somebody does not feel entitled to that, if they feel like they've got to be productive and be checking things off the list, it can be difficult then to make the shift to feel like it's okay to just let down and play and escape. And sex is at its heart, and when I say sex, I don't mean necessarily heterosexual, penis and a vagina sex. I'm talking about sex as just an erotic space that people enter into. It involves all kinds of touch and pleasure. So sex is at its heart two conversations at once. A conversation that a person is having with themselves and a conversation they're having with their partner. And I don't mean a literal conversation. It's a conversation in quotes. This idea of a great sexual experience rests on the ability to connect with yourself and your own body. How am I doing? What do I need more of? What do I need less of? What are my thoughts? What are my feelings right now? And just being able to be present, focused, mindful, at ease with oneself, and simultaneously connected with one's partner, able to reach for a partner, stay connected to them. How are they doing? And I love, again, another quote from Esther. Erotic intimacy holds the double promise of finding oneself and losing oneself. It is an experience of merger and of total self-absorption, of mutuality and separateness. And it ultimately, when it goes well, when people are cultivating and supporting their own and each other's sexual needs, it ends up being an asset to the relationship, as I said before. Last point on this is to also just know, I want everyone to know that struggling from time to time with sexual desire is normal. It is normative. One study by David Schnarch of over 20,000 couples found that 85% of couples at some point, 85% of couples at least some of the time struggle with sexual desire. It is normative for desire to ebb and flow for all kinds of reasons. Medical problems, stress, kids who aren't sleeping at night, changes with medication, changes with menopause, changes with midlife, all kinds of things. Okay, so rather than, so there is the issue of a desire problem or a desire discrepancy, and then there is the story that people start to tell about it. And couples can get themselves into real trouble by creating fear-based stories about it must mean that we're doomed. It must mean we've fallen out of love. It must mean that we're broken. It must mean that you're broken. It must mean that I'm broken. So resisting the urge to meet a desire problem or a desire discrepancy with a panic-loaded, fear-loaded story, and instead to stand shoulder to shoulder and look together at this and say, what are we going to do? What are we going to do about this? What does this mean? Why is this here? How are we as a couple going to navigate this? Okay. We are to the time. I've got a couple of things I want to say before I don't know if there are questions that are coming up, but let me just tell you a few practices about a few practices that I encourage couples to use to nurture their relationships. First one is couples therapy, as I've mentioned before. Second one is an intervention that my friend Eli Finkel tested and has some really pretty amazing data about. He calls it the marriage hack. So, and it fits with what we were saying earlier in the webinar about the my stuff plus your stuff equals our stuff. So he found in his study, I won't go through all of the details, but the bottom line of the study is that the thing you should do is if you have a fight, step away and write about the story, tell the story of the fight from the perspective of a neutral third party who has both of your best interests at heart. That simple activity of writing about a fight from the perspective of a neutral third party who has both of your best interests at heart is good for your relationship. It ties to relationship satisfaction. It prevents a decline in relationship satisfaction. So again, it's that space of looking at the bigger picture. The more I do this, the more you do this, and taking that kind of more neutral stance. I want you to know about love languages. You may already know about this because Dr. Gary Chapman has sold a lot of copies of his book and his work around this. This is this idea. I love sending couples to his website to take the test, like a little quiz, to discern your love language. The idea here is that we all have a particular channel on which we give and receive love most effectively, but there are different channels. For some, it's quality time, spending time together, going for a walk, going for a hike, going out to dinner. For some, it's words of affirmation. Tell me that you see me, that I'm beautiful, that you love me. For some, it's acts of service. When you take my car and get the oil changed before I have to even ask, that feels like love. Receiving gifts. When you think of me and pick up, something just because you think I'm going to like it, that feels like love to me. Or physical touch, back rubs, making love, snuggling on the couch. So get wise and get curious. Understand what is your primary love language and what is your partner's love language. I really feel like we could cut the misunderstandings in this world down by a great deal if we knew this about ourselves and each other, because what often happens is that we project our own way onto our partners, and it creates misunderstanding. So get curious and then see what it feels like to do things for your partner in the language upon which they best receive love. And then I love this practice. It's called the Caring Days exercise. So partner A lists 10 to 15 things that when you do them, I feel cared for by you. Partner B lists 10 to 15 things that when you do them, I feel cared about by you. You exchange them, exchange your lists, you discuss the lists, and then you do those things. It's another way of putting into practice this idea of different love languages, right? And they need to be specific, tangible kinds of things. Don't be a jerk, does not count. When you give me a hug before you go through the mail, I feel loved by you. That's a specific thing, specific and doable thing that your partner may not even know matters to you. But it's that way that's both of these exercises really fit with the idea of being proactive, of waking up each day and thinking, what can I do to brighten my partner's day? And if a marriage or a relationship is made up of two people who are asking that question, you're going to be good as gold. John Gottman, one of the preeminent researchers in the study of marriage, talks about love maps that we each carry. Well, ideally, we carry our partners around inside of our heads. And so, for example, my hope is that my husband will come home from work today and think about asking me how the webinar went. And I'm going to remember to ask him about a big meeting that he had today? So that way in which we kind of carry our partners around and, think, how are you feeling any better? Or how did that conversation go? In his books, he's got some neat questions for couples to kind of continue to cultivate those maps. So they're rich and multifaceted and filled in. I'm going to leave you just with this last quote. Politics aside, I love this quote that really captures um, a healthy, happy relationship. Sometimes when we're lying together, I look at her and I feel dizzy with the realization that here is another distinct person from me who has memories, origins, thoughts, and feelings that are different from my own. So the idea that to not take each other for granted and to really stay curious and to stay aware that our partners are not us, and to hold on to that kind of curious and compassionate place. I'm going to turn it back over to Cassie and see if we've got any questions that I can respond to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Solomon, for all of this great information and sharing these great exercises at the end. I think that those are super helpful. And we do have a few questions. Mark is writing in just a question asking what if your partner is unable to overcome those quote unquote fear stories?
Right. Well, I mean, one, of course, I'm thinking about therapy, and very often couples therapy is more effective when each partner, or even in this case, a partner who's really struggling with fear stories, when that person has some individual therapy, that can be very helpful. So oftentimes it's nice to have a couples therapy going and simultaneous individual therapies. And then at the Family Institute, obviously, we're always coordinating between therapies. But the what if the partner can't get over a fear story, the question I would be asking in Mark's shoes would be, how can I be an ally to you? How can I be a supporter to you? When I suspect you're getting lost in a fear story, what do you need from me? How can I show up for you? That would be the question that I would ask, what I would want Mark to ask the partner is,
Mm-hmm.
honey, I feel like you're getting lost in a fear story. What can I do? How can I be with you? What do you need from me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful. And Rachel is writing in asking, what advice would you give to someone whose partner has a problem offering emotional feedback?
A partner who struggles to offer emotional feedback. I just recently did a newsletter where I shared all these hacks that I've gotten from couples over the years for how they get around this. So I'm trying to think off the top of my head what some of them were. For couples where one or both partners struggles to have difficult conversations, I've heard things like they do it over, they do letters, they write letters to each other. Um,
Oh.
they put it in the third person. So he feels like blah 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 blah, yes, and he feels like, so kind of putting it in the third person, taking it a little bit less personally. I've
Mm.
met a couple who used puppets when they needed to have difficult conversations. I met a couple who used pirate voices when it was time for a difficult conversation. I met a couple who would only have difficult conversations in the bathtub. So couples can get creative. Like, yeah, if face to face, like hardcore is difficult, find ways to add a little bit of play, levity, and a puppet, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. That's great, Dr. Solomon. These are really helpful tips. And before we have one more question that I'd love to get to, but before we do that, I want to ask you if it's all right if I share the handout, the resources with everybody in the handouts tab right now, as well as in the follow-up email.
Absolutely. Yeah, that'd be great.
Great. So everybody, I just want to let you know it's in the handouts tab. You can download that as a PDF now. So that you can do that now as well as if you're watching the recording later. And then Dr. Solomon, our last question is basically coming out and asking, how often would you recommend couples go to therapy?
Yeah. So I thought it was going to be how often do you recommend couples have sex, and I just saw research that suggested that there was like the sweet spot of once a week, that you didn't get, couples who had sex more than once a week didn't get any additional boost to their satisfaction from having sex more than once a week. But that is, I really encourage couples to not get lost in sort of like the how often, but really to focus on the quality. But how often go to couples therapy? I am really passionate about reducing the shame and stigma about couples therapy. We are willing to hire coaches for all kinds of stuff, nutrition coaches and athletic coaches and coaches to help our kids learn how to ride bicycles. But we are really resistant and reluctant to go to couples therapy. And oftentimes it takes years and years before couples do that. So if you carry nothing away from this, it would be my challenge to you that the very first time your partner brings up, honey, I think we could use some therapy, that you go that very moment. When I have a couple that comes in and one's been asking for years, there is such a thicker wall of resentment built up that just makes our work together that much harder. So reducing the shame and stigma. I oftentimes encourage, we at the Family Institute encourage a dose-based approach. So you do a dose around the transition to marriage, you do a dose around the transition to parenthood, you do a dose around, toddlerhood. So sort of like coming and going. I have couples where we're in sort of our third chapter of working together, and they leave for a while and come back for a while. So I would say set a very, very low bar for yourself. Go, when couples come in premaritally, sometimes they're ashamed. They think, does this mean that we're in trouble? But I celebrate it. Like, to go early on and get a map of who you each are and how you connect and grow that relational self-awareness is such an awesome way to get started on the right foot.
This is great, Dr. Solomon. We still have questions coming in. And I know we're hitting 1 o'clock, but I definitely want to, like, the last question, Dr. Solomon is asking, how do you find a therapist? And maybe this can be our last closing note, as well as if you have anything else you'd like to share before we end for the day.
Yep. So in your handout are some suggestions for how to find a therapist, including some websites that curate lists by geography. And of course, if you're in the Chicago area, reach out to me, absolutely, and I will help you get connected at the Family Institute, most likely, or in the community. I have tons of connections in Chicago and elsewhere. So if you want to reach out to me and say, I'm in X city, I may know somebody there or know somebody who knows somebody there, and I'm happy to get you connected. But there are some suggestions in the handout, and certainly in Chicago, we've got Family Institute has locations in Northbrook and Evanston, downtown Chicago, and Westchester.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Solomon, for all this great information. And Lisa is writing in if you all can share the recording of this, and that definitely, we highly encourage you all to share the recording of this presentation once we send this out later today. And of course, let us know if you have any questions. Thank you again for everyone for joining us, and Dr. Solomon for all of this great information. You can find all of our upcoming webinars at alumni.northwestern.edu/career webinars. Have a great rest of your day, and go Cats.